There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. You know the one. You wake up in the morning and before your eyes have fully adjusted to the light, before you have spoken a single word or checked a single notification, something tightens in your chest. A low, persistent hum of unease that you cannot quite name and cannot quite silence. It is not fear exactly, though fear is somewhere inside it. It is not sadness exactly, though sadness visits too. It is something more like a constant awareness of everything that could go wrong, everything that might already be going wrong, everything that you cannot control no matter how carefully you plan, no matter how hard you work, no matter how vigilant you remain. You go through your day carrying it. You have learned to function with it. You laugh at the right moments and answer emails with the right tone and make dinner and hold conversations and do all the things that life requires. But underneath all of it, the hum continues. And sometimes in the quiet moments, the shower, the drive home, the last few minutes before sleep, it rises. And you find yourself thinking about a conversation that went wrong 3 weeks ago, or a decision you have to make that has no good options, or the version of your future that looks fine from the outside but feels like standing on ice you cannot see the depth of. This is not weakness. This is not dysfunction. This is what it feels like to be a thinking, caring, aware human being in a world that provides no shortage of things to think and care and be aware about. And the reason it matters, the reason you are here, and the reason this is the kind of question that sits at the heart of what the Stoic path was built to explore, is that this feeling has a history far older than you, and it has a response far wiser than anything the modern world has yet produced. Almost 2,000 years ago, in a city that no longer exists in the form he knew it, a man sat down at the end of a long and exhausting day and wrote to himself, not to be published, not to be remembered, just to think. Just to work through what he was feeling, what he was failing at, what he was still trying to understand. He wrote in Greek, though Latin was the language of his empire. He wrote in fragments, some of them a single sentence, some of them several paragraphs. He was not a monk or a hermit or a man who had retreated from the world. He was, at that moment, arguably the most powerful man alive on earth. His name was Marcus Aurelius, and he was anxious. That last sentence should perhaps stop you because the image we carry of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, the ideal of Stoic composure, the man carved in bronze on a horse in the center of Rome, does not have room in it for anxiety. The image is of serenity, of control, of a man who has solved the problem of inner life. But the notebooks he left behind, the ones we now call the Meditations, tell a different story. They tell the story of a man who struggled genuinely and repeatedly with the same torment that wakes you in the early hours. The difference is not that he did not feel it. The difference is what he did with it. To understand what he discovered, you have to understand what it cost him. And that means going back to the beginning, not to the philosophy, but to the life. Marcus was born in Rome in the year 121 AD into a family of considerable wealth and social standing, but not into imperial expectation. His father died when he was 3 years old. He was raised primarily by his grandfather and his mother, Domitia Lucilla, a woman of remarkable intelligence and character who seems to have shaped him more profoundly than anyone else in his early life. He was a serious child, not a joyless one, but serious, drawn to ideas, to questions, to the practice of philosophy before he was old enough to fully understand what philosophy was. At the age of 17, something happened that would change the entire trajectory of his existence. The Emperor Hadrian, aging, childless, watching the horizon for a successor, looked across the landscape of Roman aristocracy and found Marcus, not for any military accomplishment, not for any political maneuvering, but for his character. Hadrian saw something in this quiet, studious teenager that made him believe he was looking at the future of the empire. He arranged for Marcus to be adopted into the imperial line, setting in motion a series of events that would lead, eventually, to the throne. Marcus did not want the throne. This is the detail most people miss, and it is the detail that changes everything. He did not pursue power. He did not dream of it. He wrote explicitly in the Meditations that one of the things he was most grateful for was that he had never been seduced by the fantasy of being a philosopher king. He understood, even as a young man, that power was not a reward. It was a burden, and the burden, when it finally settled fully on his shoulders in 161 AD when he became emperor, was heavier than almost any man has carried in the recorded history of the world. Consider what his reign actually looked like. Not the coins with his face on them, not the marble busts, the actual texture of the years. Within the first year of his rule, the empire was struck by a major military crisis on its eastern frontier, requiring him to send forces to a war he had not started and could not fully control. That war brought back, along with its soldiers, something far more devastating: a plague. The Antonine Plague, as historians now call it, swept through the empire for almost 2 decades. Estimates suggest it killed somewhere between 5 and 10 million people. It moved through cities and armies and families with a speed and cruelty that had no precedent. Marcus lost soldiers. He lost advisors. He lost friends. He almost certainly lost members of his household. Then the northern frontier erupted. Germanic tribes crossed the Danube in ways they had not crossed before, threatening territories the empire had considered secure for generations. Marcus, who had been trained as a philosopher, not a general, who had spent his formative years reading Epictetus and Marcus Antoninus, not studying military campaigns, had to spend the better part of a decade living in military camps on the edge of winter, conducting a war that never quite ended. Writing in his notebook at night by whatever light was available, trying to hold himself together and hold the empire together simultaneously. And through all of this, the plague, the wars, the political betrayals, the grief, he kept writing. Not strategy, not history, not memoirs meant to justify his decisions to posterity. Just private notes to himself, reminders, corrections, the ongoing work of the man trying to apply what he believed to how he was actually living. What he wrote about again and again, with a repetition that makes clear these were not solved problems but recurring ones, was the nature of anxiety, the nature of the mind that reaches forward into futures that have not happened and backward into pasts that cannot be changed, and in doing so, abandons the only moment in which anything can actually be done. He wrote about fear. He wrote about the exhaustion of carrying things that were not his to carry. He wrote about the habit of the mind to multiply suffering by imagining it first, experiencing it second, and then replaying it endlessly after. And he arrived, through years of lived practice rather than abstract theorizing, at something that modern neuroscience and clinical psychology would spend the 20th and 21st centuries independently rediscovering. He called it, in essence, the distinction between what is up to us and what is not. But in his hands and the actual texture of how he applied it, it was something more specific, more ruthless, and more genuinely liberating than that phrase suggests. Here is what Marcus understood about anxiety, and here is why it matters to you right now, in your actual life with your actual problems. The mind that suffers from chronic anxiety is not a broken mind. It is a very intelligent mind doing a very specific thing very badly. What it is trying to do is protect you. It is scanning for threats, calculating probabilities, running simulations of possible futures, flagging dangers that have not yet materialized but might. This is not irrational. In the evolutionary history of human beings, this capacity was genuinely useful. The mind that could imagine danger before it arrived was the mind that sometimes survived. The anxiety response is not a malfunction. It is a feature that has become, in the context of modern life, catastrophically over-applied. Marcus understood this not in neurological terms. He had no access to those. But in phenomenological terms, he understood it from the inside. He noticed that his own mind had a tendency to do what he called borrowing trouble, to reach into an imagined future, extract some possible catastrophe, and begin treating it as if it were already real. And he noticed something important, that the suffering this caused was not proportional to the actual danger, that the anticipatory suffering, the suffering of imagining, was often far greater than the suffering that came if the feared thing came at all. He wrote, You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. But that line, beautiful as it is, can be misread. It sounds like it is telling you to think positively, to reframe, to choose a better attitude. That is not what Marcus meant. He was making a more radical and more precise claim than that. He was saying that the contents of your mind, the thoughts you have, the interpretations you apply, the evaluations you place on events, are the only site where your freedom actually exists. Everything outside that, other people's behavior, the economy, your health, the weather, the outcome of things you set in motion, is not fully under your control, no matter how much effort you apply. And the suffering that comes from anxiety is almost always the suffering of trying to control what cannot be controlled, or of treating the imagination of harm as if it were the experience of harm. This distinction, which sounds simple when stated plainly, is in practice one of the most difficult and most transformative ideas a human being can genuinely internalize, because the mind resists it. The mind says, but if I stop worrying about the bad outcomes, I will be unprepared when they arrive. The mind says, my vigilance is protecting me. The mind says, the moment I relax my grip on all of this imaginary catastrophe, the real catastrophe will come. And Marcus knew this objection intimately. He lived it. He dealt with actual catastrophes. He could not have simply dismissed his problems as imaginary. Some of them were devastatingly real. The plague was real. The war was real. The betrayal by one of his most trusted generals, Avidius Cassius, who launched a rebellion against him in 175 AD, was real. Marcus's response to that last event is one of the most astonishing things recorded in the history of leadership. When Cassius was killed by his own soldiers before Marcus could reach him, Marcus expressed genuine regret that he had been denied the opportunity to pardon the man, not to punish him, to forgive him, because holding the anger, harboring the bitterness, spending energy on resentment, these were, in Marcus's framework, ways of handing your inner life over to someone else. Taxes paid to people who had not earned them. What Marcus found, and what you need to hear with more than intellectual attention, is that the practice of distinguishing what is up to you from what is not up to you is not a philosophy of passivity. It is not resignation. It is not the spiritual bypassing of real problems. It is rather a surgical redirection of finite energy. You have a limited amount of attention, a limited amount of psychological strength, a limited number of hours. Any anxiety that comes from trying to mentally manage every possible future outcome, every possible opinion someone might have of you, every possible way that something could go wrong, that anxiety is not neutral. It costs something real. It consumes the very resources you would need to actually respond to the things that do happen. Modern psychology arrived at essentially the same conclusion through a completely different route. In the 1950s and 60s, a psychiatrist named Aaron Beck began observing something specific in his patients who suffered from anxiety and depression. He noticed that their suffering was not primarily a response to their circumstances. It was a response to their interpretation of their circumstances. The thought preceded the feeling, and the thought was often automatic, so fast and so habitual that the patient was not even aware of it as a thought. It had the texture of reality. It felt like perception rather than interpretation. He called these automatic thoughts, and the therapy he developed around working with them, cognitive behavioral therapy, became one of the most validated psychological interventions in clinical history. And at the heart of it was an insight that Marcus Aurelius had written privately in a military camp on the Danube 17 centuries earlier, that it is not things that disturb us, but our judgments about things. That sentence is from the Enchiridion of Epictetus, the teacher who most shaped Marcus's thinking. Epictetus himself had lived as a slave, a detail worth pausing on, because it transforms what might otherwise sound like the comfortable philosophy of a man who had never truly suffered. Epictetus had no legal rights over his own body. His master once twisted his leg until it broke, and Epictetus, by one account, simply noted, "If you continue, it will break." There was no rage in his voice, not because he was indifferent to pain, but because he understood, with a clarity that had been purchased at enormous cost, that his master had power over his leg and no power whatsoever over his response to what was happening. The inner life was the only thing that could not be taken. Marcus absorbed this teaching not as a comfortable doctrine but as a practice. He returned to it constantly in the meditations, not because he had mastered it, but because he had not. He was reminding himself, correcting himself, beginning again, which is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Stoic practice. It is not something you achieve, it is something you do, continuously, imperfectly, every single day. If you have found yourself pausing during this and genuinely thinking about your own life, that quality of attention is exactly what the Stoic path exists to cultivate. If this kind of exploration is something you want to continue, subscribing means that every time a new inquiry opens up, it finds its way to you. Now let us bring this into the actual texture of your life, because philosophy that cannot be felt in real circumstances is not philosophy, it is decoration. Think of a moment at work, a specific one, if you can find it, where something went wrong that involved other people's judgment of you. A presentation that did not land the way you hoped. A decision that was criticized. A moment where you felt the ground shift beneath your professional identity. You know the feeling that followed. Not just embarrassment in the moment, but something longer and more corrosive. The replay. The way the moment returned to you unbidden over days, sometimes weeks. The mental rehearsal of what you should have said. The catalog of evidence that you are not as capable as you had hoped. The anticipatory dread that it will happen again. That people have revised their opinion of you. That you are being seen in a way you cannot control or correct. Marcus would look at that experience and say, let us separate what actually happened from what you added to it with your mind. What actually happened is that you made a presentation and it received a critical response. That is the objective fact. Everything after that, the interpretation of what it means about you, the projection of how it has changed others' perception of you, the anticipation of future failures that have not occurred, that is your mind's addition. Not reality, not fact, interpretation. And here is the question Marcus would ask, and he was serious about asking it. Is that interpretation helping you? Not, is it true? That is the wrong question. The interpretation might feel true. It might have some truth in it. But the question is whether treating it as the complete and final truth about your situation is serving you. Whether the suffering you are generating due to this interpretation is proportional to its actual usefulness. Whether the vigilance you are maintaining, the constant mental scanning for signs of further judgment, is protecting you from anything real or simply exhausting you. The person who has not yet found this distinction will do something predictable in the weeks after that difficult moment. They will shrink. Slightly. Almost invisibly. They will qualify more. Offer opinions less. Bring more caution and less genuine engagement to situations that require creativity and courage. And the cruel irony is that this shrinkage, this anxious overcorrection, will make them less effective, which will produce more moments that feel like confirmation, which will drive the shrinkage further. It is a spiral that begins not with external failure, but with the story told about external events. The person who has found this distinction and found it not as an idea, but as a practiced response, does something different. They feel the same initial sting because the sting is real and the body is honest. But they ask, what here is actually mine to deal with? What here is genuinely in my control? They might find that the criticism contains something useful, and they take that. They might find that it contains something unfair, and they note that too. But they do not allow the moment to become a referendum on their identity. They do not permit the imagination to generate futures that have not yet arrived. And they return, not easily, not perfectly, but genuinely to the present circumstances, where the work of the day actually lives. This is not callousness. It is not the suppression of feeling. Marcus wrote about grief with a tenderness that makes clear he was not trying to eliminate emotion. He was trying to stop the amplification of emotion through unnecessary interpretation. The Stoics drew a clear distinction between what they called passions, those overwhelming, cognitively distorted, emotional storms that take over the mind and leave no room for clear thought, and what they called good emotions, which included genuine joy, caution about real dangers, and the warmth of real love. They were not against feeling. They were against the suffering that comes from treating every feeling as an instruction, every discomfort as a catastrophe, every fear as a fact. Now think of a relationship in your life that costs you energy, not one that is simply difficult in the ordinary way of things, but one that leaves you consistently drained, or your time in the other person's presence, or your anticipation of that time, produces a low-grade anxiety that you have learned to manage but never quite resolved. Maybe it is a family relationship where the dynamic is old and deeply grooved, where you always play a certain role and resent it and play it anyway. Maybe it is a friendship that has become one-directional in ways you have noticed but not named. Maybe it is a professional relationship where power is distributed in ways that make honest communication feel dangerous. Marcus spent his reign dealing with relationships exactly like this at a scale most of us will never encounter. He had to maintain relationships with senators who were scheming against him, advisors whose counsel he could not fully trust, a co-emperor and adoptive brother named Lucius Verus, who was talented and genuinely loved by Marcus, but who was also impulsive, indulgent, and sometimes a liability to the empire they were supposed to be governing together. Marcus did not resolve these relationships by transforming the other people. He could not have. They were who they were. What he did, and the meditations are full of this, was repeatedly, deliberately, reset his relationship to his own expectations. He wrote something that sounds almost startling in its directness. Begin the morning by saying to thyself, I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, unsocial. This was not cynicism. It was not the bitterness of a man who had given up on people. It was a form of premeditation, a deliberate morning practice of remembering that other people will be who they are, that this is not a problem requiring your outrage, that your equanimity is not contingent on their behavior. When you have a difficult relationship in your life, the anxiety it generates usually has this shape. You are trying to manage a variable you cannot control. You are hoping, consciously or not, that if you behave in just the right way, say just the right things, offer just the right amount of yourself, the other person will change, will finally see you as you want to be seen, will stop doing the thing that hurts, will become who you need them to be. And this hope, which is understandable and deeply human, is also a mechanism for perpetual suffering, because it makes your inner state dependent on the decisions of someone else. What Marcus found, and found through decades of practice, not through a single insight, is that genuine freedom in relationships comes from making your well-being genuinely independent of what the other person chooses to do, not independent of caring, not independent of love, but independent of needing them to be different in order for you to be at peace. This is one of the hardest things in human experience. It asks a great deal, but it also offers something that no other strategy can: the possibility of being truly present in a relationship without the ongoing negotiation between who the other person is and who you need them to be. Now think about grief, because there are people reading this who are carrying grief right now, not as a clinical condition, but as a permanent new feature of the landscape. Someone gone who should not be gone. A version of your life that ended and was not replaced by anything that feels adequate. A relationship, a career, a version of yourself. Something that was real and is now past and will not come back. Marcus knew grief of this kind. He lost children. He and his wife Faustina had at least 13 children, and many of them died young in infancy or early childhood, which in the ancient world was common, but was also, and this seems obvious, and is somehow often forgotten, devastating. Each time. He wrote about this with a restraint that actually makes the grief more visible, not less. There is a quality to his language when he approaches these losses. A gentleness, a slowing down, that tells you the losses were real and that the composure required enormous effort. He did not advise himself to stop grieving. He did not instruct himself that the grief was irrational, or that the dead were fine somewhere, or that he should focus on gratitude. He did something more honest and more useful. He asked himself, what is the nature of this pain? Is this pain the loss itself, or is this pain the ongoing insistence that the loss should not have happened? Because those are not the same thing. The loss is real and the grief of the loss is real, and that grief deserves its full weight. But the additional suffering, the resistance to the reality of what happened, the argument with what is, that additional layer is not grief. It is a different kind of pain, and unlike grief, it has no natural end. Grief moves if you let it. Not out of your life entirely, not into absence, but it moves, it changes form. It finds over time a place to live that does not block every other experience. What prevents it from moving is not the love that sits behind it. That love is right and good and should be honored. What prevents grief from moving is the mind's refusal of the fact of loss. The daily, exhausting work of arguing against what has already happened. Marcus wrote, "Loss is nothing else but change, and change is nature's delight." That sentence, stripped from context, can sound cold. Read it in context. Read it as coming from a man who sat by more than one small grave, who watched a plague move through his city, who lost friends and colleagues and the version of the life he had expected. And it reads differently. It reads as a man trying with everything he has to find a way to stop fighting the universe and start living inside it. And here is where the modern neuroscience becomes not just interesting, but genuinely useful. Because what Marcus was describing, the practice of distinguishing between the event and the judgment placed upon the event, the deliberate return to what is actually present rather than what is feared or mourned, maps almost exactly onto what researchers now call the default mode network and its relationship to anxiety and depression. The default mode network is the neural circuitry that activates when you are not focused on a specific task, when your mind is at rest, when it is wandering. And what it primarily does, in people who suffer from chronic anxiety and depression, is generate what researchers call mind wandering that is predominantly negative and self-referential. It reaches into the past for evidence of failure. It reaches into the future for evidence of coming disaster. It constructs narratives in which the self is at risk, inadequate, or under judgment. This is not random. This is the default mode network doing what it evolved to do, in a context where that function has become counterproductive. And what reduces this unhelpful default mode activation across multiple studies and multiple populations is exactly what Marcus was practicing. A form of attentional training that brings the mind back to present sensory and cognitive experience deliberately and repeatedly, without judgment of the mind for having wandered. This is why the daily practice Marcus described in the Meditations works, and why it works in ways that are not merely poetic. When he wrote about beginning the morning with a preparation, with a deliberate orientation toward what the day would actually require rather than what he feared it might bring, he was doing something that we now understand disrupts the default mode network's tendency toward anticipatory anxiety. He was training his attention to live in what is, rather than in what might be. Here is the practice, one single practice, specific enough to be in tomorrow, simple enough that it will not require anything you do not already have. When you wake up tomorrow, before you pick up your phone, before you begin the calculation of what the day requires, if you take 5 minutes to do this, write down on paper if you can, but anywhere that works. 3 things. First, one thing that is actually within your control today. One decision, one action, one response that is genuinely yours to determine. Not a hope, not a wish, something you can actually do. Second, one thing that you have been carrying as a worry that is genuinely not within your control. And write it as a statement of fact, not a question. Not what if something goes wrong with the project, but the outcome of the project review is not in my control. Write it plainly. Let it be true. Third, one small specific intention for how you want to show up today. Not a personality goal. Not be more confident, but a behavioral commitment. I will ask one honest question in the meeting instead of staying silent. Something that takes the philosophy and makes it visible in the actual texture of a day. This practice, which takes 5 minutes and costs nothing, is not journaling in the therapeutic sense. It is not self-improvement in the motivational sense. It is what Marcus was doing in the Meditations. It is the daily practice of sorting, of holding each morning the basic question of what is mine and what is not, and returning yourself deliberately to the territory where your freedom actually lives. The neuroscience of why this works is straightforward. Writing engages the prefrontal cortex, the seat of deliberate, rational thought, in a way that diffuses the amygdala's automatic threat response. When you take something that exists as a formless anxiety, a cloud of possible harm, and reduce it to a written sentence, you perform an act of neural regulation. The brain processes the threat differently. It categorizes it, and categorization is the beginning of appropriate response rather than generalized alarm. Marcus did not have access to this language. He had only his experience and the experience of Epictetus and the other Stoic thinkers he drew from. But he noticed the same thing they described, that the act of naming, of clearly and deliberately identifying what you are actually dealing with, changes your relationship to it, not by making it smaller, but by making it definite. Anxiety prefers the indefinite. It thrives in vagueness, in the unnamed and unexamined. The moment you look at it directly and write down what it actually is, something shifts. Not everything, not always, but something. Let us return to Marcus because there is a dimension of his story that is rarely discussed and that matters enormously for what we are talking about. He lived with chronic physical illness. The exact nature of his condition is debated by historians and medical scholars, but the meditations themselves contain enough references to physical suffering, to sleeplessness, to pain, to the difficulty of getting up in the morning, to the effort required to simply continue, that it is clear he was not writing from a position of physical ease. He was writing from a position of genuine physical difficulty, and the anxiety that comes from living in a body that is unreliable, from not knowing how much capacity the day will bring, from the accumulated weariness of years of interrupted sleep and chronic discomfort. He knew that too. He wrote, "Confine yourself to the present, not as an instruction to others, as a reminder to himself, because the temptation when you are unwell, when you are exhausted, when the war will not end and the plague will not lift and the paperwork of empire continues regardless. The temptation is to project, to look at today's pain and calculate how many more days of this there are likely to be. To add up all the future suffering and carry it today in addition to today's actual burden. And that addition, that projection of future pain onto present experience, is where so much anxiety lives. Confine yourself to the present is not a teaching about mindfulness in the modern therapeutic sense, though it maps onto that. It is a teaching about arithmetic. It is saying, do not multiply your suffering. You have today's actual difficulties. Do not borrow from tomorrow's as well. Today's burden is what you were given. Tomorrow's has not yet arrived and may not arrive in the form you fear. The only thing you can actually do is what is in front of you, in this moment, with the capacities you actually have. This sounds obvious. It is obvious, and it is one of the hardest things in human experience, because the mind that is trying to protect you will insist on the calculation, will insist that you need to account for the future in order to navigate it safely. And Marcus is not saying, do not plan. He was a military commander and the head of an empire. He planned constantly. He is saying, do not suffer the future before it arrives. Planning and anxious projection are not the same thing. Planning is using the present moment to prepare for possible futures. Anxious projection is experiencing possible futures as if they were already present and paying the full psychological cost of them before they have occurred, and then paying it again when they do occur, and then paying it again as you replay them afterward. There is a question that Marcus returned to repeatedly in the meditations, and it has a quality that suggests he genuinely found it useful, not as rhetoric, but as a real probe into the anxiety response. The question is, will this matter in 10 years? Not as a way of dismissing present suffering, not as a trick to minimize legitimate pain, but as a genuine recalibration of scale. The things that generate the most acute anxiety in daily life are often precisely the things that will leave the least trace. The presentation that went wrong, the sentence someone said that is still echoing, the email you have been composing and deleting for 3 days. These are real. They are not imaginary, but they are often not proportional to the weight we assign them. And conversely, the things that genuinely matter, the quality of your attention when you are with the people you love, the small daily choices about who you are becoming, the work that you actually believe in. These often receive less of your mental energy than the acute anxieties that produce the most noise. Not because you have bad values, but because the anxiety response is calibrated to noise, to urgency, to the feeling of threat. And the most important things in a life are often quiet. Marcus understood this in a way that was partly philosophical and partly biographical. He had seen, over the course of his reign, how quickly what seemed permanent became past. Cities that had been stable for generations were disrupted in a season. Men who had been powerful were dead within a year. The empire itself, which seemed eternal and, in some sense, was not, even the empire was something that would one day be otherwise than it was. And his response to this was not nihilism. It was not the conclusion that nothing matters because nothing lasts. It was almost the opposite, because everything is temporary. What you do with your actual present moment is the only thing of genuine value. The anxiety about futures that may never arrive, the grief about pasts that cannot be changed. These are thefts from the only time that is actually yours. He wrote about what he called the view from above, a contemplation practice in which you imaginatively pull back from the immediate concerns of your life and see them from a greater distance. Not to minimize them, but to see them in proportion. To see your anxiety about what someone thought of you in a meeting as one event in one room on one day in one life among 8 billion lives currently being lived in one species. In one moment of a history that extends in both directions far beyond what any individual mind can hold. This is not meant to make you feel small. It is meant to make your suffering feel appropriately sized, which is, paradoxically, a form of relief, because much of what we suffer is suffering that has been made enormous by the closeness with which we are examining it. Now there is something in the story of Marcus Aurelius that is not comfortable, and it deserves to be named. He was not always consistent. The philosophy he practiced and the life he lived did not always match. He kept gladiatorial games, though he tried to make them less lethal. He persecuted Christians at points in his reign, though the record on this is complicated by historical ambiguity. He appointed his son Commodus as his successor, a disastrous choice that Marcus must have had some awareness of, given the evidence of Commodus's character available to him. Whether this was love overriding judgment or political calculation or simple parental blindness, historians still debate it. The point is not to preserve the image of a perfect man. The point is something more useful, that even the person who had dedicated his entire adult life to the practice of Stoic philosophy, who had thought more carefully about how to live than almost anyone in recorded history, who had written the notes that we now read as guidance for our own lives, even that person was imperfect, inconsistent, compromised by love and politics, and the limits of what any human being can see clearly about the circumstances in which they are living. And the meditations are valuable not despite this, but because of it. They are not the record of a man who had arrived. They are the record of a man who was trying every day to do better than the day before, who was arguing with himself, correcting himself, beginning again. The subscriber to any philosophy finds this either disheartening or deeply encouraging. It depends on what you thought philosophy was for. If you thought it was a destination, a state of achieved wisdom you could reach and then inhabit permanently, then yes, Marcus's inconsistencies are a problem. But if you understand philosophy as a practice, something you do, not something you become, then his inconsistencies are the most honest and useful thing about him. He shows you what genuine practice actually looks like. Not serenity, not perfection. Just continuing. Just returning. Just beginning again. The anxiety you feel is not a sign that you have failed to understand something important. It is not a sign that you are less capable than people who appear calmer. It is a sign that you are alive and aware and that you care about things that are uncertain. The question is not how to eliminate that anxiety. The question is whether you can learn to carry it differently, whether you can stop treating every anxious thought as an instruction, every uncomfortable feeling as evidence of danger, every imagined future catastrophe as a prediction rather than a possibility. Marcus, sitting in his tent on the Danube, writing by lamplight about what he was getting wrong and what he was trying to do better, he was not free of anxiety. He was free within it. That is the distinction that all of his philosophy points toward. Not the absence of difficulty, not the achievement of a state where nothing troubles you, but a quality of inner life that can hold difficulty without being destroyed by it. That can feel fear without being governed by it. That can act with clarity even when certainty is nowhere available. And this finally is why the practice matters. Not because it will make your life easier. Some of what you are facing is genuinely hard and will remain genuinely hard regardless of your philosophy, but because the energy you currently spend in anxious projection, in the multiplication of suffering through anticipation and replay, is energy that exists, that you have, that you are spending. And the question Marcus kept returning to in the meditations, the question that was really the engine of the entire project, was this: given the life I have, given the circumstances I cannot change and the ones I can, given the finite days I have been granted and the fact that I do not know how many remain, what is the most worthwhile way to spend the energy I actually have? He did not always answer that question well. Neither will you. Neither will I. But the practice of asking it, the daily return to that question, that orientation, that effort to see clearly what is yours to do and release what is not, that practice is available to anyone. It requires no equipment, no teacher, no perfect conditions. Just the decision to begin. The morning practice is where it starts. 5 minutes. 3 sentences. What is mine to do today? What I am releasing because it is not mine. How I intend to show up in one specific way. That is the door. What Marcus found, and what 17 centuries of history and now neuroscience confirm, is that the practice of living with that kind of daily intentionality does not just reduce anxiety. It gradually builds something that anxiety cannot coexist with. A clear, stable sense of what actually matters to you and what your actual role is in the circumstances of your actual life. Not a role you have been assigned, not a role you have inherited from other people's expectations. The role you genuinely choose in the territory where your choice genuinely operates. Marcus never finished the meditations. There is no conclusion, no resolution, no final lesson where everything clicks into place and the philosopher lays down his pen having solved the problem of being human. He just kept writing, until presumably he no longer could. And that feels right. That feels like what the practice actually looks like. Not a project you complete, but a conversation you keep having with yourself, honestly, without vanity, in the direction of what you most want to become. So here is the question that this entire inquiry has been building toward. And it is not a rhetorical question, and it is not meant to be answered quickly. It is a question worth sitting with, worth writing about. If you are the kind of person who thinks better on paper, if you were to look honestly at the anxiety you are currently carrying, not the version of it you present to others, not the sanitized summary you give when someone asks how you are doing, but the actual texture of it, the specific fears and replays and anticipatory dread that visit you in quiet moments. How much of that anxiety is actually about what is happening in your life, and how much of it is about the story your mind has built around what is happening, the interpretations layered over the events, the imagined futures projected from the present? You do not have to answer that question out loud, but it might be worth sharing what comes up when you ask it honestly, because the people who will read your answer are, almost certainly, carrying something very similar. And there is something Marcus understood about that too. That the philosophical life is not a solitary one. That the conversation itself, the honest exchange between people trying to live well, is part of the practice. What is the anxiety you have been carrying that, when you look at it carefully, might not belong entirely to you?